Hey there gang, welcome to part 1 of my video tutorial. Today what we're going to be focusing on is the bare essentials, basically how to set up a project in Cubase. This will work in basically any version of Cubase, even all the way back to version 3 is what I started on. I have most of my experience in Cubase 5, but I recently got Cubase 8.5, and that's what I'm using here. Should be pretty much the same in Cubase 5, save for a couple really nifty features that I'll go over, but those are completely non-essential. But it does help to organize your project in a logical manner. So to get started here, I'm going to bring up an image which basically breaks down the topography or tree, however you want to think of it, basically of how I set up a project. So over here, we're going to have the main channels that we're going to be focusing on here. So here we have left guitar 2, right guitar 1, and right guitar 2. The reason I do this, I'll go into a little later. Basically, it's just hard panning left and right guitars with a 50% left and 50% right guitars as well. You can actually quad track those if you really want to. Totally not necessary, and I actually don't do that for various reasons. I can go into that in depth as well in some later videos, maybe touch on it a bit as I'm going through here. So those are all sent to a single guitar bus here. So before we get too deep into all the rest of the stuff, let's just focus mostly here. So what you want to do is make your channels and pan them accordingly. So how I have done that here is set them up and color code them just to make it a little easier to see stuff. So you'll notice that there's no inserts on these tracks, there's no sends on these tracks of any kind. These are purely simple channels basically. So what you're going to want to do is set everything to 0. Is a good place to start there. Get your levels on your guitars and any other instruments you're going to be plugging in. We're not going to go over that in this video, but that's, I'd assume, pretty self-explanatory for many people out there. So what I've done here, you can see it's hard left, 50% left, hard right, 50% right. Pretty basic stuff here. Now in Cubase you can actually hold shift and select a bunch of channels all in one. And what I've done here is, since I use these channels the most, I'm just going to drag them and make them a little bigger. So these are the channels I focus on the most. Makes it easier to click on them and kind of view some of the waveforms a little closer, things like that. So that's how I do the guitars, just for setting up the channels. And you'll basically kind of break everything down that way. I usually start with the guitars. It doesn't really matter what you start with if you're just focusing on setting up the project. Up here I have a guitar monitoring track. What this does is lets me have a little tuner, because I have my Axe-Fx unit actually down to the right of me, and it's a little hard to see the LCD screen from where I'm sitting. So I just monitor the line, which is mono in. I'm actually using USB for my input, which I can actually show you. It looks like Cubase is actually having some issues here. So I may need to reload Cubase quickly here, but I'll show you my devices and how those are set up as well. So under device setup, we're going to go to the VST audio system, select the driver that you're using. Highly recommend using ACO for all. That's going to give you the best latency times in general. Some devices have their own proprietary ACO driver, which may actually yield better results. The reason I use ASIO for all is for the exact purpose of what I'm doing in this project, which is using 2 different audio devices for recording. So that's why I have to use this. If I wasn't, I would just be using my Focusrite USB audio driver here, or if I was for some reason didn't have my Forte with me, I'd just be using the Axe-Fx for both output and input. But sometimes if I'm doing just line-in guitars without using Axe-Fx, I'll only use my Focusrite, and I'll use the Focusrite driver because it does appear that I get better latency when I do that. But the thing is latency is not really an issue for me, and the reasoning for that is because I'm always, even if I'm recording line-in guitars, I'm always playing through the Axe-Fx and using that as a direct monitor so I can hear my playing instantly. So latency is never a problem for me because I can always do latency compensation in the actual Cubase program. So by the time I play my string and I actually hear the metronome, they will line up with each other, even if the input latency is like something ridiculous, like hundreds of milliseconds. That's just a really cool trick. If you have a amp that has an output on it of some kind, and you have a USB audio device that can accept that output, highly recommend monitoring your device, or monitoring through your actual device, not through Cubase, because that will give you instantaneous monitoring. But if you don't have that luxury and all you have is like a USB audio interface of some kind, like a Scarlett or something, use the ACO for all or the default driver and set your latencies to something that's actually acceptable to track on. So I would recommend doing all your tracking first, because you're not going to be able to track at low latency when you have your entire project filled up with effects like I have here. Unless you have like a really good computer, you're not going to be able to do that. So if you're going to be doing things the way I'm doing, like using direct monitoring with a amp of some kind, use ASIO for all. Or, I mean, actually, I'm sorry. You can also use the default audio interface driver too for that. But the reason I'm doing it the way I'm doing it is because I have the Axe-Fx and also the Forte hooked up at the same time. And you're just going to take my word on this. I have my Axe-Fx off right now, so it's not showing up in the device list. But usually it would say Axe-Fx 2 right here. I would click on the blue button, I would turn off the output, and I would turn on the input channel. Just like in Forte right here, I have the input channels disabled and the output channels enabled. So I can monitor and listen to my tracks through my Forte using that audio processing through that device, and using the input through the Axe-Fx. If you have a pod or something like that, you'll do it exactly the same way, unless you're just using only the pod for your output and input. That's how I do that. And then a lot of times you're going to have to go back to devices, to VST connections, and this is where you actually can set the actual output routing that shows up in your channel here. So this is the input, this is the output. Let's go to a wave channel. Input mono in. You can select whatever inputs you have set up. Now, you can select them here all day, but it's not going to do anything until you have set them up in the VST connections first. So basically here on stereo in, I would select Axe-Fx here. I wouldn't, because I'm only using the mono in. I'm only using one input, which is a USB input on my Axe-Fx 2. I have my Axe-Fx 2 set up that way so that it's sending the left channel as a mono output, and that's where I set it up. So I just do my Axe-Fx left output here for mono in, and that's what I use for my input. And then for my output, I have my Forte for the left and right, so I can monitor myself. So I can use my studio monitors, I should say. So that's how I do that. And yeah, so that's how you set that up. Obviously, if you have any problems, send me a message and I'll try my best to help you out. I can't really spend an hour with you or anything like that. but I can definitely point out little things that you may have overlooked if you want to send me a screenshot or whatever you're kind of coming up against. That's how I route things. So mono in would be my Axfix, and then the output. This is where you output to buses that you've created, and then obviously you can also send to sends. Your effect sends through here too. We don't do that on the instrument channels. Again, we're not going to do that. We're only going to do that on our bus channels, send things to effects. The only exception is on the drums. So, like on a kick or something like that, I will actually send that to a reverb first, so I can process that in parallel. I don't want to bus it and then send it, and then do an effect on a bus, because that's going to be a chain. I want to do it in parallel, so I can actually compress the reverb and you know, at the same time, rather than having it. I want to have my reverb, you know, basically first in the chain, but also mixing with the other effects. I don't want it to be in a chain after a certain effect. The reason I do that is because that's the way that you can get the most cleanest sounding reverb without a whole bunch of crap in it that you have to EQ out. You're still going to have to EQ out crap regardless, but this is going to make your mix sound so much better if you do it this way. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to show you how I actually wrote those things, but just keep that concept in mind, that certain instruments like the overheads, toms are going to have different types of reverbs, and they're going to be sent to an effects loop so that you can send those effects loop to a bus for processing. You can even have you know, reverb in your bus if you want to, but general rule of thumb is not to do that. For your drums, you want to have effects loops for your reverbs. Same thing with vocals. Guitars are different. Guitars are all about chains. You want to chain your effects with guitars. You can run in parallel things with your guitars if you want, but I generally don't. I think it's unnecessary, and it goes against the general philosophy that goes behind mixing guitars, which we'll get into in the next video. So again, just really quickly, I had to restart my program because my streaming software actually disables Windows Aero theme, and you need that to run Cubase 8 to see these things up here. So that's how you do that. Monitoring track, always nice to have. I just turn off the monitor here when I'm not using it. It's not really going to be using much processing power or anything like that. Second thing in the list here is going to be drums. Right now I'm using Steven Slate drums. A lot of people use Superior Drummer, maybe Easy Drummer and stuff like that, but I am using Steven Slate. I like how it sounds. Getting really good results out of that. I also have a second drum. These are VST MIDI channels, by the way. Both these here. So the Superior one, all it is just a single China that I like. So that's all that is. Nothing fancy in here either. Just I'm routing basically in Superior. I'm finding the overhead that the China's on. You can see I am routing that to bus 16 here. Also, some other mics are picking up that that China are also being routed to the bus 16 in Superior. So, and then that is getting routed to the Cubase out 16. I will show you how to do that as well. So just bear with me here. I will have to reload the program. Obviously, I will cut that out of the video. But before we get too far into that, let's just focus on the basics here. I have a virtual bass track as well. I'm not tracking real bass at this time, so I'm using Trillion. I'm not gonna go into depth about effects and things like that in this video, but we'll get to that later. So that's my virtual bass track that I just draw a simple, with the draw tool, I just usually draw a track out, and then I open up my score editor, and this is where I can do all my programming. I can, edit things according to the notes I want to do, quarter note, half note, whatever it might be. And I can also quantize or whatever I want to certain beats as well. So if I wanted to only do 16ths, I can do that and just drag them 16ths. Or if I want to drag a 16th only a quarter note, quarter beat, I can do that too. That's actually really important for when you're actually mapping things out. But that's something we will go into detail later. So that's just how I set that up. I have a couple lead guitar tracks here. These are my super wet tracks, which are basically just have a heavy reverb, sometimes, or not heavy reverb, heavy delay, with a high amount of, feedback, so that it kind of has more of a bigger sound with that. You don't get as much clarity in the notes, but that's not what you're looking for in these tracks. You're looking for more of an ambient feel with that. I also have a second one just in case I want to automate volume. Or, for instance, sometimes I will set up a second bus for this so that I can control the the mix of the reverb without having to automate it. Because automation is something I loathe doing a lot of, so I try to just simplify that a bit by just making multiple tracks. Not everybody's going to be able to do this because you have to have a fairly powerful computer to be able to process that many tracks at once. For me, it's not a problem. I have a dry track here, which is in the center. This is basically for your center guitars that you don't want effects on, or just very minimal effects. Solo channel, that's going to be for still going to have some effects on that, but that's going to be for like your solos and leads and stuff like that. You can see I have a couple here in the song. That one's going to punch through more than the ambient tracks here. I also have a solo left and a solo right. You can see I pan them roughly 50%. It's not actually perfect, but I'll fix that right now. So yeah, those are, so basically sometimes I want to have two lead guitars going in the center of the mix, because if you have two lead guitars directly center, it's gonna cause a lot of problems. Volume problems, compression problems, phasing sometimes. Also, you will have a mushy sound. It's not going to sound clear. So that's why I do that. I also have a second solo basically for automation as well. So if I want to do one lead that doesn't have a certain effect on it, but it has the same settings, give or take, as the other lead track, that's what this one's for. Then I have my ambient tracks. I use my clean guitars for the ambient tracks here. I could label them clean, but they're almost exclusively used for clean guitar. So same deal here, center track, and then these are panned hard left and hard right, because when I do clean guitars, generally they're not going to be center type leads type things. They're actually going to be taking over what the regular rhythm distortion guitars would be doing. I don't use this bass track, so I don't know why it's here. I am actually going to hide it, which is one of the coolest features about Cubase 8, is you can actually turn off track visibility. I believe you can do that in Cubase 5 as well, but I'm not positive about that. Synth track here, massive. I have an array of synths I use right now just for purposes. I'm just having this one in here. my piano track. I do a lot of piano type stuff in my mixing, so I have that one in there. One thing to note, I'm still working on the mixing with my piano tracks, because a lot of times I will open a song with piano, or I will have parts that have where the piano is going to be the main instrument in that section, and I don't want to really EQ that to take out the dynamics from that part, because that's going to be the only instrument in that part. So I don't want to cut. I don't really want to EQ it like in a way that it makes it fit in a full mix. So right now I don't have any EQ on that except for this. Yeah, I'm not using EQ with that. So, however, if I had a part in the song, say whether there's good distortion or lead going, I will usually automate that effect. So I'll have a set up EQ for it, like Fat Filter or something like that. I'll just use the default one, but I'll usually do high-low pass and boost some mids like that, and then play around with it. If that's also same concept with leads or synth leads and pads and stuff like that. Depending on the actual pad itself, some of them already have built-in filters, and you don't really need to mix them that hard into the mix. They'll fit right in, right from the get-go. So, spent a little time on that, but that's fine. Turn off that effect for now. These, so here, let me clarify something here in my project. The, what looks like the middle, giving you the middle finger here, these tracks are all buses. If it has a wave like next to it, that's an actual audio track. This is a bus. Cubase calls them group channels. Same thing, bus group, same thing. So these are basically controlling my lead guitars here. Like front G correlates with the front G is front guitar. Correlates with dry, with the dry track, solo left and solo right, and solo, the automation solo track. I actually, for the dry one, that's sent to front G, D. D means duplicate, or I guess you could say dry, because I want to have the effects, the delay effects and reverb effects off for that one. So you can see I turned that off. Looks like I do have some delay on, but it's probably set pretty low on this one. Either way, that's how that works. Super Wet obviously is the bus channel for these two tracks, and I like to use buses, even if it's kind of redundant, because I could have just put the inserts of the Super Wet track. I could have copied this insert chain as a preset, loaded it right into the Super Wet channel. Would have been basically the same thing. But the thing about this whole tutorial or instructional video I'm trying to do right now is to teach people a proper way of thinking about coming at a mix. So you want to think of everything in a hierarchy. There's always layers and layers and layers to a mix. If you get stuck in the mindset that you can have just two guitar tracks, have all your effects on those, same thing with bass, same thing with it, you're gonna end up with a subpar mix. You're not gonna be able to control the sounds. You're not gonna be able to compress things. So it's good to get in the habit of bussing as much as you can. So I'm actually gonna turn on my buses here because they're hidden right now. My guitar bus, and I hide my buses because once I have those basically set, I don't want to accidentally bump the automation area, because this is like the automation line here. You can turn on or off or set levels of automation here. So I actually bump that by accident sometimes up here because it's right next to the locator. So I turn the visibility off on that channel once I have it set how I want. but I'm gonna turn it on right now so I can show you what's going on. Turn on all of my FX channels and my drum channels as well. Turn off that bass. There's a couple other buses. Oh, there's some buses that were hidden. Like the ambient guitars actually have their own bus for the clean guitars. And then there's actually a second one too. Because again, I like to double things up to avoid having to automate too many things. Getting hit of my e-cig here. So that's basically that. So now I'm going to focus a little bit on explaining how the buses work and how things are routed to them. So hopefully this makes sense to people. How I set this up. The guitars, since when you're mixing in the beginning, you're going to be using your guitar bus constantly, just finely tweaking things until they start sitting in the mix how you want. So I usually have this one up at the top somewhere, and when I'm done with it, I usually hide it. Second one, monitor, because I do tend to tune my guitars every session when I start. Maybe if I'm halfway through the session, I'll usually retune them because I play pretty hard. So guitar bus on top, drums at the top as well, because you're gonna be editing those probably, if not the most, close to the most of any other thing in the project. Here's my drum channel here. This is all logically set up as well. So everything has to be, doesn't have to be, but it should be ordered in a logical manner. So obviously the things you use the most are going to be at top, and their types of instruments and types of what you want to utilize it should be grouped similarly. So obviously my guitar tracks all grouped together, color coded. My bass track towards the top, color coded, and then my lead tracks. That's the order of use basically, and color coding. So my heavy delay one's blue, my drier, my center guitar leads all in orange. My bus channels, I just decided to do pink, or purple I guess that is. And these are pink for my clean tracks. And then some of the other stuff, like the buses, you can color code them however you want. Just do it in a logical manner. So all of my FX loops are color coded blue. My submix, which is some people call second bus or bus 2 or whatever, that one I have yellow. But it's obviously same color as the guitar tracks, but I put it at the bottom. So be logical about how you order those. All my drum mics are green. I do have a couple buses in here too, actually. So I'm actually going to color code those right now. Let's see, where is that? That's why I might need to restart Cubase. There we go. It's a control click. Yeah, we can do that color, it's fine. That makes a little more sense then. Cool. I'll hide my transport bar here. So that's basically it. Now, if I want to show you, like, this video is not geared towards beginners necessarily. This one, I would say, you should already know how to add channels to the project. You should already know how to create a group channel. You should already know how to make an effects channel. If you don't know how to do these things, I would recommend going and finding a basic Cubase tutorial before you watch this video. The rest of the video is definitely going to be a lot more in depth, and it's going to be a little more advanced when it comes to that kind of stuff. So, I accidentally turned down some tracks I don't want. Okay. And that button turns on all the tracks, I guess. So, that's how that's set up. Now, going into busing and how that's done here. All these guitars, this is the output selector here. I route those to the guitar bus. This is my guitar bus. I will briefly go over some of the effects just for fun here. Open up what I got. Vintage equalizer, colors the sound a little bit. FabFilter, it's more transparent sounding, much more surgical. Got the center plug-in here, which is kind of like it's a stereo imager type thing. I have my compressor, actually the default Cubase compressor, nothing fancy there. This one's not meant necessarily for like crushing anything or anything like that. This is also side chained. So FabFilter, again, this is the secondary EQ for that channel. You always are going to use 2 to 3 EQs. With FabFilter, you can actually get away with using only 2, which is one really awesome thing about it. And then also the NLS channel stereo compressor, which is nice to flatten out the tracks for mastering, basically. Well, I guess it's not necessarily for mastering. I send that to my sub mix. Actually, I have a bus before that where I bus both my guitar buses and my bass bus into a bass guitar sum bus, and that is then sent to a sub mix bus or second bus or bus 2. Basically, the final link before the master output. So this is a little diagram that shows that. So my channels, they go to my buses here. My main buses, the first buses in the chain are the guitar, bass, clean guitar, lead guitar, center guitar, and then I also have those ambient ones too. I didn't put in here, so I ran out of space, but you get the idea. Those are all routed, or not all, I should say, but pretty much all of them are routed to the submix bus. The clean, lead, and centers are directly sent to the submix. But my guitar and bass bus, like I was talking about earlier, gets sent to their own bus for kind of controlling those tracks together. And then they're sent to the submix bus. And basically how the drums work here, same deal here. The kick mic group is sent out from the actual Steven Slate drums to its own output in Cubase. That's sent to the drum bus. Then I have some other instruments sent directly to the drum bus: overheads, toms, hi-hat, room mic, except for my snare. Snare is extremely important if you want a full sound, big sound, professional sounding drum kit. One of the biggest factors in the tone of the kit is coming from the snare. So I have 2 snare channels in Steven Slate drums. I do this so I can process them in parallel with each other to get a more control over the sound. Those are sent to a snare bus. I call it snare sum. The snare sum is then sent to the drum bus. Drum bus obviously then sent to the mix bus. This might be getting a little confusing, but if you study this image, pause the video, and set up your whole project with this like this, you're going to be set up right away. Just if you set it up this way, I can guarantee you your mixes are going to be better than if you didn't set them up this way. Basically, snare, sum, since we're kind of on this topic right now, those are sent to my FX loops. I have sent them to a snare hall reverb FX channel and a drums hall reverb FX channel. So certain instruments, or certain drums I should say, are going to require different reverb effects and such to sound correct. You don't want them all to have the snare, have a snare reverb, obviously. And you're going to want to send these individual channels with varying degrees, mixing them in. Basically, the send gains are going to be different because you don't want to have, you know, your overheads with a massive amount of reverb on them, things like that. So I have a couple different reverbs set up here. I also have on the drum bus, it's sent to a parallel compression effects loop, so I can do some parallel compression there. That's the only thing I really do with this effects loop for parallel compression, is just for the drum bus. Alright, so moving on. I guess it's I can go over the effects loops now. So extremely important for getting a massive drum sound. Also equally important for getting a massive vocal sound. I do not have vocals in this song currently, so I don't have any mixing tips for that at the moment. But though I will go over that eventually. So here are my effects channels. Effects loops, I should say. Effects sends, however you want, whatever you want to call them. Let's see if I can. I guess there's not really any way to bring that out more, so. I'm going to show you my inserts on these quickly. Reverb, stereo imaging, EQ, compression. Pretty standard setup here for the effect. This is basically just for your reverb. So you want to control, filter out things you don't want, get the right stereo imaging on that so that the drums sound like they actually exist in a real space, and then obviously compress them so that they're ready, they're flattened down and they're ready for basically gain staging, higher compressing and limiting once you're finished up on your mastering output. So, and depending on the type of effect, you may or may not use certain things like parallel compression. You're not going to use a stereo imager on, obviously, for that channel. So fun stuff like that. My snare hall reverb, love it. That's one of my favorite things about my mix right now. Getting the snare reverb to sound perfect. I really am satisfied with what I have there. But it's just the same basic setup as the other room reverb I have set up. And then I have my drum hall reverb for some of the other mics to get sent here instead of, you know, well, usually I have the room and the hall reverb. Most of the instruments are sent to that, aside from a couple. And you'll see that in my organizational chart here. So I'm just kind of studying my own thing right now. Yeah, the snares, the toms, the hi-hat, or excuse me, the snares and the toms are sent to the large room, because those are kind of known. Like, I guess when I mix my drums, those are the instruments I definitely want reverb on. That's what makes you have a really big, massive sound, especially when the toms start building up or start doing something. You want some reverb on those to give a nice spatial effect. Same thing with snare, so that's why those are sent to the large room. Snare, my snare sum, which is the two snares, those get sent to their own snare hall. So I have two reverb settings for my snare drum, basically. One to makes it sit in the mix with the rest of the drums, one makes it stand out so that it can sound more massive, basically. So that's why I do it that way. Let's see here. I'll actually show you in the project too how it's routed. So kick is sent to the drum bus, and the sends here, I don't know why I have this here. Oh, that might be my side chain. Basically, yeah, I think these are side chains for my kick. Yeah. Kick gets sent to large room, snare large room, second snare also large room, varying degrees of send gain. Toms large room. Overheads, these are going to the hall reverb because it's going to give more of a room effect for the cymbals. I guess my superior drummer, the China I was using, I guess I overlooked this when I was setting it up because I actually added that in way late in the game. That's actually not sent to anything. Oh wait, no, I did bus it to the drum bus, okay. And it sounds really good to me how it is, so I haven't really messed with it. Hi-hat sent to hall reverb. And then the room mic, that's there to capture the room sound. You don't really want to mess with that. You'll basically mix that through the drum bus and get that level set to where you don't want it to sound boxy or crappy or anything like that, but it gives a added realism to the drums. So that's why that's there. So that is basically how I set up the mix. The only other thing is the sub mix here. I think of the sub mix basically. People do things a lot of different ways when it comes to mastering. People have completely different theories on how they do it. I kind of take two different trains of thought and I combine them. So one train of thought is you send things to the stereo out without doing the sub mix, and then you bounce that down to a wave, and then with that wave file you master the wave file using a different project. That is essentially exactly what this is doing, except I'm doing it in real time. It saves me time, it saves me a headache. I don't have to bounce something down or rebounce it down over and over again. I can hear it right away. And the arguments against doing it this way is that with the VST instruments and certain effects, they get processed just a little bit different every time you play them. So for consistency's sake and stuff like that, some guys will always bounce down a wave before sending it to like a master output. I just don't do it that way. I don't think it makes a big difference, and it works great for me, so that's why I do it this way. So here's my submix. My submix is essentially a mastering channel to level things out. People might argue with me about that in the comments, but basically this is to flatten the project, to get the peaks and the transients all kind of crushed into a small band, something that I can work with to master. Because if you have a lot of dynamics in your mix before it's sent to the master channel, you're not going to be able to get the volume you want. You're not going to be able to get a lot of things. Let's just put it that way. Ozone 5, a lot of people are familiar with this program. Basically, this is a mastering suite. So, imaging for basically the entire mix. There are several things that are not sent to the submix, but basically everything is routed here at some point or another for the most part. All my effects loops, my drum bus, which is all my drum mics, my guitars. I think the only thing I don't send is like a couple like samples. I don't send like my my bass drops. I want those to kind of stand out on their own. And the piano, like I was talking about earlier, because I want to keep the dynamics with that. that's something I can just kind of notch out in EQ if there's a problem with it. I do think eventually I will start mixing that into the rest of this stuff, but it's something I added late in the game when I was working on the song. I didn't think I was even going to use it, so, and it sounds good how it is, so I'm leaving it for now. But yeah, so this is just basically I could have done all this in one instance, but I didn't want to use every single effect in here. So I just used the ones I wanted to use. Imaging. So I haven't really gone over the theory of how to chain effects or anything like that, but that will be in my next video. I'll kind of go over some of the mixing philosophies and stuff like that. And even before I think I make that video, I'm going to go over the philosophy behind mixing metal, the things that you want to focus on, and basically going over guitar tone, drum tone, and your overall goals that you're trying to accomplish in the mix. So just briefly, I'll go over the submix. Imaging, basically spatial stuff. I do have a compressor right off the bat. Another compressor here within Ozone. Another imager. Equalization. Another compressor. But this one kind of adds a kind of like a tape feel to it. So this is actually for coloration a little bit. And then also another imager. So the focus here is to get things flattened out. The imaging helps a lot with that because bass and stuff like that, you want to keep it, fairly center in the mix, and stuff like that. So it just really depends. Yeah, so these are basically kind of just set for basic imaging right now. But you want to keep bass kind of in the center and everything else kind of going out towards the sides. And one thing is stacking compressors. You also stack imaging, because I found that simply just like boosting this up here, it is oftentimes a little too much, because by the time that you're adding another compressor and other things, you just brought yourself a whole nother problem. So actually stacking compressors and stacking imaging can let you do incremental steps and make fine corrections as you move along. Something that took me a long time to learn. So that is the submix. Someone's texting me. And then that gets sent to the master output channel. And kind of touching back with what I was talking before about how I kind of both trains of thoughts on mastering, I actually do bounce down this project, and then I do a final compression and limiting on a separate program altogether. That's my final master, is done in a different program with the wave file, the bounce down wave file. I'm not gonna really show that right now. I guess I could show that right now. But yeah, just more EQing here, some excitement. I didn't put the exciter in the submix, because that's kind of like a master, like a exclusively for mastering type thing. Yeah, and then I have some other, compression and stuff like that going on here. So some of the stuff, it doesn't really necessarily matter what you use. The reason I use these is because they give a nice coloration, or kind of a feel to them. And I just like how they sound. FabFilter is known for being very transparent, so it's good to use at the end, at the beginning, or at the end of a lot of, I guess not necessarily at the beginning, but definitely at the end of your chain, because it's not going to change what you've already done too much. So that's kind of what's going on there. So what I do is I use a program basically from like the early 2000s here called Adobe Audition. Oh, that's actually already mastered, but that's okay. So this is kind of an example of what a bounce down wave would look like from my project here. I'm getting way ahead of myself here. This is definitely very late. This is gonna be in like the final videos, but just to give you a taste of what is coming. This is the program I finalized my stuff in. So I love this compressor. I don't know why. It's a simple multiband compressor and limiter. Basically, I use this for EQing. To be really honest with you, this is for getting my volume higher and for EQing the individual bands that need work. Like if I left out a little bit of shine in the guitars, I boost the 1K range here, 3.5 dB. I usually compress a little bit of the low mids because that's what gives you that kind of scooped heavy feel. And I boost and also cut, or I boost and compress at the same time with that area. That's the only thing I really do. I don't put any thresholds on the 1 kilohertz range here, because that just basically makes it sound like you put a blanket over that range. Bass, I just kind of bump it up a little bit to give a little more bass in the mix overall, and boost it a little bit in the upper region here around 9 kilohertz, just for some sparkle, and a little bit makes the guitar sound a little bit more distorted. My attack I have set, medium, so I have a decent amount of punch with it, but not like overly punchy. And release, I have it set very quickly on this particular mix right now, just because of the nature of what's going on in the mix here. I'm actually going to have to automate this. It's probably going to have a slower release in other parts of the song where there's not as much instruments playing at one time. Yeah, so I probably shouldn't mess with that. But you could see how when I messed with those, it started getting muddy. So the whole point of this is just to give me a little bit of boosted volume and to add just a slight EQ to stuff. I really like, this is one, I don't know if this is one of the original, but this is a very old compressor from Isotope, and they're huge, now they're one of the biggest names in effects, VST effects. But this is a really old one, very simple, and I like the way it sounds. It has like this kind of a digital feel to it, a digital kind of sound. I've always really, really liked the way it sounds, and almost every single one of my mixes uses this as the final effect, and it definitely makes my mixes, like if one of my mixes are playing, you can almost tell right away it's mine, just because of this effect. So, kind of a little signature thing of mine. I wouldn't even recommend using that. I think that there's other ones that would sound better, like Waves or something like that, or even Ozone. So, something to play around with potentially if you want to try out new things, but this is basically how you set up a project here. So, obviously, we didn't go into chains and why they're chained the way they are, or effects I'm using to a deeper extent here, but you can see how I'm doing stuff. So like just regular wave channels, we don't have any inserts, we don't have any sends on these, anything like that. I have an EQ on here, but it's disabled. Sometimes I like to just spot check stuff, and that's what that was about. Submix. That's my bus, one of my guitar buses. So bass overdrive pedal, or it's not. I guess that's a guitar overdrive pedal. I don't use this channel though. This is actually a wave channel. I could bounce down my virtual bass and send it here to add a little bit of grunge to it, which I'm actually considering doing, because my bass right now sounds really clean, which is actually something I like about it, but I'm always open to try new things. So hope this video was informative. Part 2 will be coming out probably in a couple days here, and we're gonna go over the theory behind mixing guitars, how to get those set up. I might actually have a tutorial for each type of instrument, and then from that I'll go into effects and how to actually EQ and do those types of things with each type of instrument. But I think a good place to start would be to go over the instruments, how to actually set them up by themselves. So like obviously these are guitar channels, there's no effects on them, but that doesn't mean that there's no effects here. This is all my Axe-Fx. These are wave files sent right from my Axe-Fx, and obviously my Axe-Fx has effects on it, and it has its own channels and cabs and everything on its own. So that's first thing going in. That's the first thing going in here, and everything from there gets sent out. So it's a little bit different for the VSTs, obviously. But I mean, same. I guess it's actually kind of the same concept. You can control some of the stuff right in the VST itself, some of the EQs and things like that, like in your bass or in your synths. So we'll go over all that in the next video. But again, thanks for watching. Hopefully this is informative again, and I will be adding more very